Are you ready to become a change maker? Our 48-week postgraduate program in public policy or the PGP may be just the thing for you. This hybrid program is designed to give you both the theoretical foundation and hands-on experience needed to excel in policy making. With a mix of expert-led webinars, in-person workshops, and policy simulation exercises, you'll gain real-world skills along with personalized mentorship. Through our policy programs, we connect good people to good ideas and good networks. Apply now at the link in the description to make an impact.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. I'll be your host for today. My name is Kripa Koshy, and as some of you may know, I am a program manager at the Takshashila Institution. Today's episode is going to take a closer look at India's mechanism to release prisoners, particularly in light of prison overcrowding, significant number of folks in jail who are awaiting completion of their trials. But don't fear, I'm not here alone. I have roped in two experts who are going to help, I think, demystify some of this particular challenge. So I'll take a moment to maybe formally introduce our guests and then sort of lay out a little bit of context. So first, I'll say welcome to our guest, Shreehari Paliath, who has reported on public policy around labor and employment, agriculture, water, and elections. He received a special mention at the 2019 Red Ink Awards. He has a postgraduate diploma from the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai, and a master's degree in development from Azim Premji University. So welcome, Shreehari. Lovely to have you here.
Hi, Kripa. Thanks for inviting me to your show. Look forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah, I do too. And our second guest, Leah Verghese, is a lawyer and a social scientist with a wide-ranging experience in corporations, nonprofits, and political campaigns across India. Her particular interest in UTRCs, which will be an acronym that we'll decipher as the episode progresses, stems from her experience with Amnesty International India. She is a graduate of Columbia University and the National Law School of India University. Welcome, Leah. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Kripa. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion together. I'll just maybe set a little bit of context that, will just help the listener through our discussion here today. So as you both know, and our listeners may have seen in the media, the India Justice Report 2025 was recently released. For those in the know, it is a national periodic reporting that ranks the capacity of states to deliver justice. So really, I'm hoping this is a timely discussion, but it does paint a fairly bleak picture, actually, of what the justice system looks like in India right now. I thought before diving into maybe the specifics of the report, I thought it would be useful to sort of set the stage a little bit with an excerpt in the report's foreword that was actually written by Sanjay Kisan Kaul, who was a former justice for the Supreme Court of India. And it might set some of the expectation and tone for our conversation today. So I'll just read this quote, so you will have to bear with me. We must recognize that the core thesis that emerges is not a critique of the people within the system, but rather a lament for the system itself, which for too long has been denied the inherent capacities required to function independently of the efforts of those who serve within. So I'm going to set that out there and then maybe in passing mention a bit of a statistic here. So according to a 2024 Supreme Court Center for Research and Planning report on prisons, there were about 5.7 lakh prisoners who were confined in various jails across the country, of which 76% were reported as under-trial prisoners. And that's going to be the scope of our discussion today. An average overcrowding in prisons actually stands at an alarming number of 131%. But even that is really an average. And there, of course, are outliers of even further overcrowding there. India itself has reported to have the fourth highest number of people in prison in the world after the US, China, and Brazil, according to a 2022 World Prison Brief data. So I'm going to maybe stop over there because I've mentioned rather like a few points here now of overcrowding being a problem, of prisoners under trial being sort of a population that's of particular concern. So maybe I'll open with a very rudimentary question for folks who are jumping in cold here, and I'll direct maybe my first question to Shreehari. It's a very rudimentary question. I'm going to ask Shreehari, why is overcrowding actually a problem for us to be concerned about in prisons?
So, Kripa, overcrowding quite simply is a problem because, if you're confining a custodial population to a space that does not have the infrastructure to sort of accommodate you, it's simply inhumane and dehumanizing. So if you look at the section on accommodation and ventilation in the 2016 prison manual, the model prison manual, it clearly states that no ward in a prison shall accommodate prisoners beyond its prescribed capacity. So like you rightly said, the current occupancy rate in prisons is around 131%. So basically the occupancy rate is defined as the number of inmates staying in prison against the authorized capacity, which is around 100. So if you're saying only 100 people are supposed to be fit or accommodated into the prison ward, there are 31 more people who've been squeezed into that space. And you have multiple court orders. And I mean, it is against basic humanity to sort of push people into a space which does not cater to that sort of a requirement. So basically what happens in prison custody, it is implied that there are certain restrictions on your basic rights, but that does not take away your basic dignity as a person. So when you say 31% overcapacity, that's an overall India picture. But if you look at specific states and union territories, for example, Delhi has a occupancy rate of 185%, UP has 180%. So you can imagine the problems that come with it. And this overcrowding is not a very India-specific issue alone. I mean, the narrative and the conversations are relevant in other places, but because of the absolute number of people in our prisons, it creates all kinds of issues. I mean, for example, you'll have problems around mental health and increased violence, self-harm, the obvious issue of lack of capacity, etc. So it basically tells you about how our justice system is functioning and the requirement, let's say, for reform in policing and prisons and, of course, our judicial system.
Yeah. And I think even in passing, I know we are, our population of focus is our prisoners themselves, but I'm just thinking of even the supporting resources to be present in the prison infrastructure to be able to cater to this particular population, right? I'm thinking of, welfare officers, social workers, psychologists, physicians who are part of the ecosystem and required to be there for prisoners. And I can imagine that there's a particular strain and pressure that those individuals as well have to bear in this particular context, right? Like the downstream impact of having such a crowded space is also seen on the resources that have been hired to help support the population.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in the sense that if you look at the prison data, which is now at least 3 years old, it's from 2022. And we're still awaiting data for 2023. Of course, I mean, it's going to take its own sweet time. I'm assuming it'll be sooner than later. But if you look at that, you look at certain resources, human resources, you don't have psychologists, psychiatrists. There is a dearth of medical professionals, etc. Most of the systems are contracting it out to systems outside, and it's not someone who's there full time. So that creates its own challenges, and probably the budgeting itself. I don't know how seriously all states take it. Your criminal justice, particularly prisons, it most certainly is not right up on the priority list as far as I understand.
Yeah. I think that's very helpful context, I think, for listeners to have.
Just if I could just jump in, Kripa, just one thing when we talk about overcrowding is we always look at averages, whether it's a national average or a state average, and that average may actually disguise outliers that are really egregious. For example, in most states, the prisons that are in urban areas in big cities will be really overcrowded. So even if you're talking of a national average of 131, I think numbers from 2023 in Karnataka showed that like Mangalore district prison had an occupancy rate of 175%. So if you look at some of these individual prisons, they are really overcrowded.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful nuance to introduce. Actually, it's true that sometimes the outliers fall out when the average is mentioned. Yeah, rightly said. So very helpful, I think, for listeners to keep that in mind. So I'm going to maybe shift our conversation to the a particular proportion of prisoners as under trial prisoners in particular, right? And really a question for both of you here. Would you be able to share a little bit more about the history, the role of under-trial review committees, or UTRCs, as was mentioned in the introduction as well?
I think undertrial review committees were initiated after the Supreme Court's 2015 directive. Basically, there was a PIL in 2013 where the issue of overcrowding, etc., including lack of infrastructure, need for training, I mean, issues that you are talking about, were highlighted. In 2015, I think the Supreme Court issued a few directives which required the National Legal Services Authority and the Home Ministry and the state legal services authorities to ensure that the under trial review committees were formed in every district. So their essential purpose is to ensure that under trials are identified based on various categories. Initially, it was 3 categories, and now I think it's been extended to 14, which includes, various categories like, people who are in jail and unable to, despite getting bail bonds, they're unable to furnish surety, and therefore they stay on in jail, which is actually a travesty of the entire system. So currently, the UTRC is a district level committee, which is headed by the district's session judges, which includes your magistrate, the SPA, secretary of the DLSA, which is the District Legal Services Authority, and of course the prison in charge of that district. And the entire process is initially initiated by the prison system, and then it sort of moves up the system, if you can say so. And the recommendations are then made. It goes through the trial court or the judicial system. And although the recommendations are made, it isn't binding on the system to sort of ensure that all these people who've been recommended for release end up being released. So there are these, nuances and challenges within the system
itself. Yeah, that's helpful to hear. Leah, anything else that you wanted to add about UTRCs?
Yeah, so UTRCs again are one of the many mechanisms that courts have tried to devise to reduce the under trial population. And this excessive under trial population problem has been around like since the late 70s, and it's something we just haven't been able to solve. The under trial population just hovers around 70 to 75% every year. And again, UTRC is another mechanism which has been around now for about 10 years, but again, hasn't really solved the problem. And I think we'll go into the reasons why a little later.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a good segue, like you said, Leah, of, so that we've been hinting at the fact that, if the population size that we're talking about has, like you said, hovered at that same number for a while, or the proportion of population that remains as under trial prisoners is sort of the same, then it must mean that there is a particular challenge with the review committee itself. I mean, the fact that we are just talking about a decade-old mechanism, I don't know if that means that there's still a lot of learnings to sort of happen as it makes its way through the justice system, or that it's a sufficient enough time for us to assess whether it's working or not working. So I'll leave that to the listener to decide. But yeah, I think open to both of you. But Leah, if you'd like to begin, particular challenges that you see with this mechanism, because I think for the lay listener, it seems like a great idea that, in 2015 seemed like a good move to say, why not have a dedicated committee with this explicit mandate of let us reduce this population that is sort of languishing under trial for such a long while. Yeah. So yeah, challenges with the committee, Leah.
Yeah. So Kripa, as you mentioned, on paper, it sounds like a great idea. But the reality, and Shreehari has hinted at this, is that, a recommendation for release of under trial prisoners from the UTRC does not actually translate into actual release. There is a saying, there is many a slip between the cup and the lip. That's what happens with these UTRC recommendations. Under trial prisoners are in what is called judicial custody, which means custody of a court. So it is the court which can actually order release and not the under trial review committee. So once the under trial review committee lists out the prisoners who are the under trial prisoners who are eligible for release, that list has to go to the court. And usually what happens is the under trial prisoner will need a lawyer to represent them, because the judicial proceeding will then start. If the person doesn't have a lawyer, then the DLSA will recommend a legal aid defense counsel, now known as LADC, to represent them. So then a petition is filed for bail, and the magistrate has to decide that case. The magistrate will usually impose some conditions known as bail conditions. These can be surety, cash bond, or a personal bond. Then the under trial prisoner has to fulfill those conditions. Only then they are eligible for release. So I think some people think that once the UTRC has recommended release, the jail gates open and the prisoner is left out. That's not what happens. There is a whole judicial process that happens after
that
that.
kicks into place. Yeah.
And then we've seen from the latest IJR that 50% of the under trial prisoners recommended for release don't get released, because this judicial process has kicked in. Sometimes the under trial prisoner may not have the means to fulfill these conditions, and then they continue to be in prison. The other thing is about UTRCs is, like a lot of the systems in prison, there's a lot of opacity around it, because the prisons are naturally a closed system. There's very little transparency. So, as a regular citizen, we don't get to know if the UTRCs are meeting regularly, what is coming out of these meetings, what is the follow-up on the meetings, that follow-up and monitoring is really important. There's very little data out there on that. So I think that is also a challenge. And maybe regular citizens may not be interested, but there are a lot of organizations that work in this space. The media will be interested, but this kind of data is not put out.
So just to Kripa, just to add on to what Leah is saying, based on the UTRC is supposed to put out meet quarterly, and now they seem to be putting out some data. So based on the data that is available for the year of 2024, I mean, this is as of October, whenever they met. So it says that for 2024, there were around 78,500 prisoners who were identified, of which 53,500 were recommended. And finally, 1 in 3 of these people were released. That is 1 in 3 compared to those people identified. That's around 5% of the population. So you can see what Leah was saying in terms of the slip in terms of the number of people who get identified and the number of people who are able to leave prison.
Walk out of prison gates,
So if you've been able to identify, so obviously the prison system has found some reason to say that these people are eligible for this release. But what is happening in between, there's not much clarity.
And again, if we knew that, if that data was made public, like, what are the reasons why this drop off has happened, then we could maybe think of, policy measures or, steps that the prisons can take or the DLSA can take to remedy the situation. But we have no idea why that drop off is happening.
So there are a few sort of questions that I'm chewing on. I think one of which might be a very foolish question maybe to ask, like, is there scope then to potentially empower UTRCs so that they have a little bit more teeth? Because the committee itself is comprised of members that include, from what I understand, the district or session judge. There are sort of like decision makers who could possibly be in a place to be trusted in their decision making to say, and it might not be a question of trust or not. It's just that the system is what the system is, and there is a due process to follow. But is that something that could preempt this struggle of, because there's this handover happening from the committee to the court? Is there scope to possibly remove one of the actors or reassign one of the actors in this system? That maybe too simplistic a question.
Actually, the thing is, the court can't be removed from the system because eventually the release order has to come from the court.
From them.
So I think what would help would be some kind of monitoring, that some person or body outside the UTRC is actually tracking
Have
this process.
accountability.
You know, like, okay, 100 people have been recommended. What's happening next? Follow up with the LADC. Has the bail application been filed? Have the, conditions been fulfilled? Some follow up by some other body or some other person, I think, would help.
I mean, this also talks about the allocation for resources, like we are saying. Somebody has to monitor. I mean, one of the crucial links here is, how social workers get involved. I mean, and I don't think there are. I mean, at least I'm not aware of it. If there are, let's say financial resources or some sort of a security measure so that, you recruit and accommodate them within the system. I know in this Mumbai, Prayas does a great work and they're entrenched within that system. But that is a very state-specific movement or a setup. But not all states have this. Again, it questions the priority of the state government. Is the prison system or prison reform a really important task for them?
On the agenda, yeah.
Because I mean, nobody is getting votes based on your release of prisoners. I mean, those conversations don't happen, so it's not a priority for many of the politicians and the government functionaries.
Yeah, and like was said earlier, I think by both of you, that the system lends itself to that type of invisibility when it's sort of contained and managed as a very closed ecosystem away from the prying eyes of a caring public. Then there's not too many. It becomes harder then to raise the profile of such issues before a politician who then can have the political will to change something or not change something or prioritize spending in an area versus not, right? So that's a really good point. I think I'll maybe bring us maybe to a case that I know that Shreehari, you had looked at very briefly in October 2024, which was the Suhas Chakma versus Union of India case. Could you maybe talk about why that was a significant case that you sort of mentioned in your reporting on UTRCs as well?
Yeah, so the Suhas Chakma case I mentioned because one, it was very recent, and again, what it does is it reiterates what the previous court orders had talked about in terms of ensuring humane treatment of prisoners and the need to decongest prisons. And importantly, it also talks about access to legal aid. I mean, this has been said over and over again by different courts and particularly the Supreme Court. Essentially, it said that the legal aid is not a matter of privilege, but it's a constitutional right. So when the original petition was filed, this was during that peak of COVID, when there was a lot of conversation around decongesting prisons, and the fact that there were cases about within the prison system. Of course, very little came out of in terms of data, and we don't have a very great picture of how many people were actually infected. But some of the states, I think Delhi did a reasonably better job in terms of sharing that information. So that it was filed at that time. And again, the court sort of reiterated the importance of sort of saying that, you can't have a system where you congesting prisons to a point where it cannot cater to accommodate these people. The order by itself, I think, put out around 16 directives, one of which is relatively new, where the Supreme Court has asked the high courts to consider the feasibility of issuing a practical direction to the effect that, I mean, they're saying that append a cover sheet to the judgment informing the convict or the person about the availability of free legal aid. Basically, you give them the information saying this is available to you. These are the remedies if you want to appeal, etc., or access legal aid. You've been given the contact details of the people who might be able to help you. So that, in some sense, allows them to stay informed. At least that's the assumption. And I think the judgment, therefore, sort of establishes mechanisms for better aid. Now, we need to see how well this is sort of happening, because this isn't something new. I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about legal aid, but it just, adds more might and strength to the existing mechanisms.
Yeah. Actually, that's maybe a good segue for me to then direct that question even to you, Leah. Before, I do want to touch also on bail briefly. But before we go into that, since we're on the train of discussing legal aid, I thought, earlier on in the conversation when I quoted Judge Sanjay Kishan Kaul, I thought it was a very striking quote that he has in the IJR, which is, prisons cannot rehabilitate if legal aid is ineffective, which seems like pretty self-evident as sort of a statement. And the large number of under trials against convicted inmates is a reflection of this problem. So yeah, if you could sort of tease out a little bit more of the considerations or the struggles that exist around legal aid, despite knowing that actually, constitutionally, it should be something that is ensured for this particular population.
Yeah, so as you've rightly identified, legal aid plays a crucial role in preventing this kind of prolonged detention of under trial prisoners. So, a lot of under trial prisoners don't have access to competent legal representation. At the time of arrest and maybe at the early stages of their detention, they may have a private lawyer, but over time a lot of private lawyers lose interest because they're not being paid regularly. Some people's families don't have enough money to pay, so that private lawyer stops taking an interest. It's very important in those circumstances that there be a robust legal aid system so that these people are represented
Fill in the gap.
effectively.
Yeah.
Effectively in court. So when I started working on under trial detention, this was about 10 years back, the legal aid lawyers who represented under trials were the regular panel lawyers, and there were a lot of problems in that system. They were not paid adequately, there was very little accountability, and so there were a lot of delays in their hearings, and there was very inadequate representation. In recent times, there is this LADC scheme, which is the Legal Aid Defense Council scheme, which has been implemented, which is much better. As of, I think, 2024, 613 districts in India have this scheme. So these LADCs are better paid. There's a lot more accountability and some kind of monitoring that goes into it. So things have improved on the legal aid front because of the LADC scheme. There's still, of course, a problem of shortage, which is a problem that plagues the justice system overall. There aren't enough LADCs for the kind of under trial prisoner population that we have. But definitely this is an improvement over the older legal aid system. I think it is time for somebody to actually do an evaluation of the scheme and actually see the impact that it's had. I think it's been around for enough. So if there are any researchers listening, this is a good area of research that you can pursue.
Yeah, we are imploring you actually to possibly pick this up as an area of assessment. Thank you for that, Leah. And I'm glad that there's some cause for a little bit of optimism here to see that there has been an intervention that has actually been able to deliver on some of its intended outcomes to some extent, while of course limited still with the capacity and resources that are available. I'm going to turn now briefly return to a point that Shreehari mentioned earlier about bail. I know that there was the 2023 cash bail scheme for poor prisoners that, again, Shreehari, you've referenced in your reporting previously. What has sort of been the struggle over there? Again, for maybe the lay listener, great idea on paper, and yet I anticipate that you're going to burst our bubble and tell us that there are actually some struggles with how the scheme has actually played out in reality.
Yeah, so the cash bail scheme came about, it was announced in the 2023 Union Budget by Nirmala Sitharaman, and it's been now 2 years. So I'd filed an RTI for my story to around 8 states, and I got a response from, I think, 5. And essentially, what I found was that other than Maharashtra, no other state, this is, I think, we published the story in November, other than Maharashtra, no other state had used the scheme. So that essentially what the scheme does is, there are a lot of prisoners who are unable to furnish surety. And the idea is that the center sort of has a CNA account, a central nodal authority, which has the funds. The states create a system, they ask for funds, that's transferred, etc., etc. It's a bureaucratic process. And there is a district empowered committee which is headed by the district collector. And there are, of course, the entire process is held together by the DLSA, who identifies people, etc. Now, one of the reasons during my conversations with my Professor Vijay Raghavan was that, in Maharashtra, it sort of worked really well because Prayas is already a part of that system, and it's fairly clear how the entire system in Maharashtra particularly works. But the fact is that because it is housed in the district collectorate, for the collector himself or herself, it probably is not a priority because they have all kinds of different tasks. So unless they have a meeting, despite this time-bound manner in which you need to identify people for release, do a background check if they are eligible for this, look at their financial positions, etc. It might take time because maybe it's not a priority for the district collector. So that in itself is a hurdle. The other point is, like I said, this requires someone to sit and identify people because it is a manual process in the end of the day. Because a prison might identify someone, somebody has to go back, check with their family, what the what that process is throwing up. That in itself doesn't necessarily sit well with the established processes within the prison administration. So that's why Maharashtra may be performing much better. So based on some data that is available from the Parliament response from this March, I think each year from 2023 to 2024, 2 years, the government allocated, I think, 20 crores. But only 22 lakhs have been utilized by 12 states, which means only 1% of it has been used. The Home Ministry itself has said that the states are not using it adequately. So there is an issue in terms of how the guidelines are being utilized and implemented within the state system, because this is, in the end of the day, the states are responsible for identifying the entire, identifying prisoners, etc.
Just one more factor is that people think that the problem of bail is just a problem of money, but it isn't, because a lot of times the bail condition imposed will be surety, and surety means it's a person. It's a person from that locality who's kind of standing guarantee
Vouching.
for the vouching for the under trial prisoner, saying that I know this person will come for every hearing, and I vouch for that person. That is much more difficult to find than cash. Actually, if cash was the problem, it wouldn't be so difficult. Every few years, you'll see some big philanthropist in India saying, oh my God, this is a problem, I'm going to give these many crores. It's not a question of the crore. Most magistrates prefer surety over cash bail or PR bond. So it's, and when the prisoner is not from that area, where will they find this person who's going to come and vouch for them? So the problem is a little more complicated than just throwing money at it. And money does sort of solve the problem, because there is a parallel economy which has developed of professional sureties. So in every court, there are some people who live around there who are sureties for many, many under trial prisoners. But that's like a black market that has developed.
So another sort of foolish question here then. If you can actually game the system and say that, yeah, no problem, I'll be the surety needed if you just pay me the right amount, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There again is no accountability or vetting process to sort of say, yeah, you can actually take this person at their word. It's just the person who verbally can attest to, I am going to serve as surety for this particular prisoner, and that is sufficient for the court's purposes.
No, they ask for some kind of some documents to prove that you live there, that you own land there. You're supposed to be a local of good repute, so you have to provide some documents. But the same person is, the surety for many under trial prisoners, which is suspect.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And I would imagine, based on what was shared, I think, Shreehari, when you talked about the allocation of funds from the union government for the purpose of this cash bail scheme, if there's such a dire underutilization of the fund itself, do you feel like then the prospect of it being available for subsequent years is now going down, that it likely may be that this is going to be picked up on? Like if it's only Maharashtra who's primarily taking advantage of this, it can be a signal, especially given the large amount that's not being used. Can it just be that in due course that it's no longer going to be available, you think?
I mean, if it's not utilized, the tendency for the government, if it's not a big budget, flagship sort of a scheme, is to sort of reduce the budget. But I think more and more states are sort of, as they realize that is available and it trickles down through the system, I think more and more prison authorities will be able to utilize it. I think there is still a sort of a awareness gap that needs to be sort of fixed, and that was the conversation I was having even during my pre-research and during my reporting. Some of the people were saying that the guidelines and the state level guidelines hadn't been issued, so it has to be contextualized. This center only provides a larger framework. Of course, they can work around this, and they have all the freedom to do that. But that sort of might take time. But now that 12 states have taken it up, I'm assuming, given the under-trial population and the fact that a lot of people require this kind of a support. One of the other data points is that a majority of the under-trial population, prison population, are from oppressed and marginalized caste groups. Many of them don't have the privilege of having a great education and probably do not go to school. So that sort of, it's a reflection of the larger malaise that exists in our society. So that's also relevant within the prison system. And therefore, these obvious issues of being able to access money, stand surety, assets that can be sort of pledged, all these become a larger problem. And for many of them, it's a routine sort of a issue.
Yeah, I think that's a sobering reality, I think, to keep in mind as we're sort of considering, even we're edging closer to even the thought of how to improve something like this, right? So, I'm going to bring us a little bit back to UTRCs because sort of that's where our conversation sort of began. And because it's what we have really right now standing as an option to ease some of the pressure of, this under trial population in particular. So, as folks who might be familiar with the IGR recommendations, one of the recommendations were to ensure compliance with the UTRC's guidelines of the categories of prisoners to be considered for release and to review the performance of the committees. Now, how do we make this practically possible? It's a big question. I know we've already sort of hinted at, accountability. We've said sort of those key ideas have come up naturally in our conversation. But what does it look like to better comply with the guidelines of the UTRC, and what does it even look like to review the performance of the committee itself, right? Like, in my mind, I can instinctively think that there's a role here for civil society organizations to play, to possibly hold such mechanisms to account in a way that maybe the lay population might not be able to. But again, the hope is that even state governments are aware that this is possibly a bit of a bottleneck, and that they are preemptively going to try and find ways to mediate or remedy some of this. But these are just my sort of cursory thoughts. But I would love to hear both of your views on this. Maybe Leah, if you want to start.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to stress on what I've already mentioned before. Transparency and monitoring, I think, is what would help. One is make the data public on how often UTRCs are meeting, what have they decided, and the next steps. It's no point just releasing the minutes of one monthly meeting, when people don't know what's happening next. And of course, connected to that is monitoring, because all the people who are on the UTRC, this is not their full-time job. They have other jobs. This is just one of the many responsibilities that they have. So they don't have the time now to be monitoring if their recommendations are being complied with or where things are getting stuck. It is essential for some other body or some other person to be doing that. And as you said, it would be good if civil society organizations can monitor it, but ideally someone within the system should be tracking this closely. I think technology can play a really good role in this, in terms of tracking, sending alerts, making those things a little simpler.
Leah's saying, in the sense that there needs to be some sort of monitoring and then follow up, and also some sort of standardization in terms of how this is getting implemented and the identification of UTRC recommendations. Each district, because its composition and context, it can't be too varied. There has to be some sort of a guideline in terms of how this is, progressing. Just from UTRC's own report for the October-December quarter, the highest number of prisoners who were identified were those who were identified under the, under trial prisoners granted bail by court but have not been able to furnish surety. Now, of the around 5,000 odd who were identified, around 56% were released. And the fact that we already have a scheme, the cash bail scheme, of course, this might have to be converted into a cash bail application, etc. But how does this sort of get streamlined, and these different systems with almost similar, members and actors, can we, have clarity on how this is working together, or if it's not, ensure that all these government programs and schemes work well together, are enmeshed in a certain way.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that part of what sort of helps with that greater cause then is hopefully conversations such as these, which sort of raises the profile of some of these issues, keeps it sort of as a topic that is top of mind for folks to have that expectation then also of government in a way, right? For that type of transparency and standardization, that type of accountability in a way. I know we're nearing the end of our time together, and I would have loved if it could be a longer chat. But given sort of our time restrictions, I'm going to wrap up maybe our conversation here. We've covered a lot of ground. The general bent of our conversation has been slightly pessimistic, but there have been moments also where we've been able to see sort of examples of how things might actually be working well, whether it came to legal aid in certain instances, whether it's, Maharashtra taking up, even some of the cash bail sort of scheme. But if you had to sort of leave the listeners, I guess, with, one or two key ideas that you think would be worth stressing, what would you sort of land on, I think? And it might even be to, maybe reiterate what's been shared right now, that, transparency, accountability, standardization really are sort of the key elements to trying to come at remedying this problem of what prisons are facing.
I would say, again, this is something I said before in our chat, that the use of technology. So I feel some of this tracking, monitoring, sending alert, these are all activities that can really be automated, and we are in 2025. I mean, we are talking of, driverless cars and autonomous drones. And, if we are not able to automate simple tasks like this, it's really a pity. We still have delays in sending lower court bail orders to high courts. I mean, it's quite ridiculous that these are not being transmitted electronically. So if we just use some basic technology, I think just some of the process can become simpler.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Leah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think all these systems, including tech, in the end, I want to go back to the beginning where I said the custodial population has to be treated fairly and humanely. There are lots of gaps in the justice system that needs to be sort of fixed. If people cannot seek proper justice, we might have a vision of becoming a $5 trillion economy in the next 4 or 5 years. But if people feel that they can't access justice, I think we have a serious problem in terms of our progress societally and as a nation. So as long as these reforms are carried out wholeheartedly and sincerely, I hope we can sort of, we'll have serious concerns.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of an excellent point that both of you have sort of landed on to keep in mind, right? Like, one, being clear-eyed about that perspective that we're trying to hold on to, and then also trying to be very pragmatic then of what could be a possible solution to try and remedy some of this challenge. So with that, I'm going to thank you both so much for your time, for your expertise, for I think even the conviction with which you've shared a lot of what you've shared. I think it's really beneficial for folks to hear, particularly those who've not had the opportunity to examine this issue in depth. I think my hope is that it's made it a little bit more clear, accessible. For those who are listening, I'm going to direct you to of course, as we've mentioned several times, the IGR, which is the India Justice Report, as well as what Shreehari is writing in IndiaSpend as well on, why India's review mechanism to release prisoners is inadequate. But with that, thank you both so much for your time, and happy reading, I think, is my wish for our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you, Kripa.
Thank you, Kripa.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.